for more on this, we're joined by Nabila Ramdani, who's a French and Algerian writer. Thank you very much for coming in. We were hearing from Jim there that oil is a very important part of the Syrian economy. Do you think this move is actually going to increase the pressure on President Assad?
Well, it definitely comes as an attempt to step up the pressure on the Syrian regime because of its relentless crackdown on demonstrations in the country. And it comes in the wake of diplomatic isolation. We've seen how the Arab League has disowned Bashar al-Assad and by suspending Syria from the Arab League. And this came as a blow to Assad because he was proud to be one of the most influential and indeed leading figures in the Arab League. So this economic pressure on the regime is an attempt to have an impact on the country. I doubt very much that he will change the way Assad conducts himself. Syria has been blacklisted by the countries like the US for years now and has been economically isolated for its alleged support of international terrorism. The middle classes and the business classes in Syria are absolutely furious about what's going on. They would like a return to stability, and they feel very much squeezed, and they're unhappy about the situation because they cannot prosper in an unstable environment. But these are the classes who can afford to leave the country. So I don't think it will have an impact on the way the regime is behaving.
Isn't there a danger that if you end up with less Western influence, if you end up with those educated middle classes leaving the country, that it simply makes the sense of isolation even greater?
Very much so, but I think we've seen how President Assad has been using the British press recently. He's given 2 interviews to Sunday papers not long ago, and he's effectively using British press to make his PR offensive. And what he's saying now is that he's warning the West against military action in Syria, saying that effectively he will create an earthquake in the region. And I have to say, I'm afraid he's quite right in his analysis, because a military intervention in Syria will have regional repercussions that we didn't have in Libya, for example. But he's also warning that he will not bow down to pressure, and he will fight in his country. Now, these are the classic lines of a dictator who is buying time for himself, coming out of a pariah nation.
Do you think there is a sense of frustration in the West that everything that they have been trying to do to put pressure on Syria at the United Nations, even some of it with the backing of the Arab League, simply doesn't seem to be having any effect? We're seeing these terrible killings of anti-government demonstrators simply continuing day after day.
Well, very much so. And in the case of Syria, it's very much more clear-cut a situation than it was in Libya, because we have, evidence that the regime is actually killing indiscriminately men, women, and indeed children have been killed and tortured. So this is very harrowing, the evidence that's coming out of Syria. And yet what we've seen so far is rhetoric and speech really coming out of the international community, with the European nations condemning the regime but not doing more than that, and the Arab League doing its bit. But again, we're talking about rhetoric. So what's lacking is definitely firm, dynamic action that will have real consequences on the way the Syrian regime is acting.
Because in a sense, it is quite extraordinary watching from here the fact that the anti-government demonstrations continue, the fact that despite all the violence, the heavy hand of the military being used day after day, these demonstrations are continuing.
Absolutely, and I think there's no turning back for those demonstrators. And if anything, the situation is escalating, because now there is an armed insurgency which is threatening the regime, challenging the regime. The Free Syrian Army is determined to challenge the regime. So the situation has gone from peaceful demonstrators to an armed insurgency being helped by Libyan elements as well, in order to topple the Assad regime.
Okay, Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.